Welcome to Fright Night.
Hi, I'm Chucky, and I'm your friend to the end.
Please welcome Art the Clown.
We can defeat death. We can achieve every doctor's dream. You'll be famous.
Second movie that I remember really strongly that I saw in the genre was The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, the Ray Harryhausen movie. And that had just lots of stop motion monsters. And that scared me too. I had nightmares about the skeleton fighting with the sword and the woman being turned into a giant snake. And so I always liked effects. In art, I always liked surrealism. I like fantastical things. So I liked fantasy and horror, which are actually kind of two sides of the same coin. If the movie ends well, it can be a fantasy film. If it ends badly, it can be a horror film. Early on, liked scary stuff, whether it was scary stories or comic books or movies or radio shows. I like the macabre. You know, when I got a chance to make movies, I just wanted to make horror movies. When I was in middle school, I really liked the Roger Corman, Edgar Allan Poe movies, The Pit and the Pendulum. I always liked it when there was something that was horrific, which there was something grisly, and I liked how Roger Corman always had these very colorful credit sequences. So I tried to do that with Reanimator, tried to make a real colorful credit sequence. I'm not a fan of gore for the sake of gore. I'm not a fan of torture porn. It's not like I haven't done something like that in The Dentist. There's right up to that point where you feel, you know, that kind of horrific revulsion. I always liked the part when, like, the Wolfman was stop motion changing, growing his hair and stuff. Sometimes you need certain elements to punctuate to get to that peak feeling, peak experience that you want to reach within a certain sequence in a horror movie. It sometimes involves blood or some kind of fluid. A movie can be suspenseful, or it can be a thriller if it's just scary, someone being chased. But the minute you start adding some kind of fluid, blood or goop or whatever's inside an alien, whenever there's something like that, then it starts being horror. There's a kind of a physical nausea, a physical kind of revulsion that I think is a part of that horror experience. For me, it's not really about the gore, although I've certainly done my share of it, and I like when I get somewhere with it.
The brain? Of course. Don't expect it to tango. It has a broken back.
God! Why does he make that noise?
Birth is always painful.
He's dead.
Twice.
I produced the first one. And so the idea of doing it was Stuart Gordon's the director. I had just moved to LA. I wanted to make movies. and I wanted to make a horror movie. I found Stewart, who was a theater director in Chicago, and he had the idea to make the Reanimator stories, which I had never read, into like a regular TV series back in the early 80s. But I wanted to make a feature film. He and his writing partners took what they had and expanded it into a movie. And I also felt like it should be extreme, that it should be exploitative. Stewart likes to shock people. I knew as a horror fan, if it was exploitative, if it had a lot of sex and blood, there would be at least a certain market for it. Because horror fans, you know, I'm a movie fan. I love all kinds of movies, every kind. But I like the good ones. But with horror, I even like the bad ones. I can watch a bad horror movie and get a kick out of it, but I can't watch a bad comedy, a bad rom-com. But with horror, I can get a big kick out of watching a bad horror movie if it delivers. If it's really weird or really extreme in some way and entertaining. I like the movies to be entertaining. I want it to be like a theme park ride, that it's obviously synthetic. So that's, you know, with horror, that's kind of where I go with it when I'm making it, and also when I watch movies. He already had a 50-page script or a pilot, and I read it, and then I read the stories, the 6 stories. They're not typical Lovecraft. They're more like just horror, like monkey's paw type of horror, things crawling out of the grave. Lovecraft is more known for its cosmic horror. So it wasn't really a challenge for me to adapt it, because Stuart Gordon and his writers, they'd already adapted it. They did the work of adapting it, and they all came from theater. And since Lovecraft wasn't really known at that time, it was a name that we recognized. Some people had read his stories, but they're very difficult to read because they're written in what we would consider an archaic style. They were written at the over 100 years ago. Today, Stephen King or Anne Rice, when they write, it's the words that get you, like Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe isn't like when he writes a story, you don't see a movie like you do with Stephen King. With Stephen King, you read his book and you can see the movie almost while you're reading it, because he's working within images. We are more visually oriented now. The idea that people were not familiar with Lovecraft. They did know his name just like I did. It always seemed like when you got to the big point, instead of showing the monster, the main character would like faint or something, you know, because the horror would be too great. It was not daunting to me to do a Lovecraft, to put Lovecraft on screen. There were no expectation for it. And in fact, the fact that Reanimator was so popular and became such a horror classic, Reanimator actually made Lovecraft more popular. It began that process. Back in the 60s, when Roger Corman was making his Poe series, he made one Poe movie after another. At one point, he made one called The Haunted Palace. Well, that was a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, but it was actually a Lovecraft story. But he couldn't sell it as Lovecraft. He sold Poe. So I think that you can see that there was no value in Lovecraft at that time. I remember a friend of mine was making cheap movies, and I told him, well, you should make a Lovecraft movie and make it H.P. Lovecraft. I think he made The Unnameable. And then people started making Lovecraft movies and referencing Lovecraft, and suddenly everybody's a big Lovecraft fan. Well, I think it is true that people tend to, you know, if I see a movie that I like, I'll go read the book. I want to see where the material came from. And of course, when I made Reanimator and then we're going to do From Beyond, I just read everything, right? All of Lovecraft's stories and books. I just read them all because I felt like now this was part of my work. And so now I know a ton about Lovecraft and I've adapted a lot of his stories, but at that time it was not a daunting task. What was a daunting task was making the sequel, Bride of Reanimator, because then I had to live up to Reanimator, and I didn't have Stuart Gordon. Luckily, I had Jeffrey Combs. So you could see there, then it was really challenging. Then I was really worried about, God, can I, people are going to expect so much. And the same thing went for the third one. And that was really a challenge. And I was really worried about that, if I could, 13 years after Bride of Reanimator, make another Reanimator in Spain with a crew that didn't know Reanimator, with Spanish crew and Spanish actors. So yeah, that's challenging. But the first one, it was just a lot of fun to make a movie.
Mom?
Oh, Billy, how sweet of you to come here to me.
Any edible fantasies you'd like to indulge in, Billy? Now's the time.
Well, son, I guess you're right. I am a butthead.
One of the best times of my life. It was just really great to do something that weird. The original script by Woody Keith and Rick Fry didn't have any fantastic element to it. It was a blood cult. This was going to be the first time that I was going to try directing. And I thought, man, as a French distributor told me once, he said, a first-time director usually makes 2 movies in one, his first and his last. Because it's easy to get a first chance to make a movie, and it's hard to get a second. So I thought, well, if this is I'm going to get to direct a movie, by God. I liked their script because it was really it was so paranoid, and I really was ready to go with it, but I wanted to have effects because I like effects. A blood cult to me just isn't very interesting. I wanted something that I'd never seen. I wanted something with that was really different. And so I imagined this idea of bodies melding together. I met Screaming Mad George, and so he's a surrealist artist. And he was an effects guy for movies. He's from Japan. I started looking at his work, and we started kind of brainstorming at the same time that I worked with Woody Keith and Rick Fry, the writers, to have them adapt the script to these visual ideas that we were having. George has a certain style of art, and I'm a big fan of Dali, and so is he. And so we based the shunting images on certain Dali paintings. So George would make a maquette, a little model, and we would, and the writers would start incorporating it. So I back engineered the shunting so that it would fit in the movie, because I wanted to see that. You can't just do what was done before. You've got to keep moving the narrative with the culture. I've got a treatment for a society sequel, and I think you can still do it. It just has to fit the story. You could do it even better now. You could use digital effects to make all the rubber effects work a little better. I wouldn't do it digital. That's it's puppet effects. The shunting, when you see the wide shot of the shunting, that's basically a guy in a monster suit. But it's 13 people in a monster suit. So in that shunting, in the wide shot, there's 13 people inside the plastic, inside the rubber, manipulating. And they even had little video to see what they were doing. Of course, you had to have a little black and white monitor with very poor quality back then to hide inside that. So it is an old-fashioned method. It's basically the guy in the monster suit, whether it be Godzilla, the Japanese Godzilla, the creature from the Black Lagoon, one of the best monster suits ever, or another movie I did with Screaming Mad George that he directed with Steve Wang, which was called The Guyver. Puppets and mechanical and makeup effects are more effective than the digital. And the reason is because it's a puppet, and puppeteers, the effects guys, their union is the actors union. If you're a puppeteer, you're an actor. And someone like Screaming Mad George, he can put his hand in a sock and make it come to life. He's a puppeteer, So if he makes it a more complicated effect, it's still the people manipulating it that make it come to life. And I think puppets work better than digital, because the process of digital is basically very sophisticated animation with many, many layers of artists and technicians building. At its best, you can have Jurassic Park. But when you don't have if you don't have tons of money, it's hard to get anything. There's something that you just know it's digital. Whereas even a cheap puppet effect is effective. So I would do it again as puppetry, but I like digital to take wires out. For example, in the shunting, you could have people with rods moving things around in the shot, because digitally you could erase them. But I wouldn't do it all digitally. I think it loses any punch.